Joining us now is Asia Society Policy Institute's Kevin Rudd. Rudd is also the former Prime Minister of Australia, of course. Great to have you with us once again. Let's look ahead to this trip.
Yep.
As I mentioned, North Korea looming large. Is there a possibility for some resolution or some progress on this trip as the president meets with counterparts in Japan, South Korea and China?
I think there's some possibility. The two signals that are out there at the moment. One is a statement from the Chinese a few days ago, normalizing their economic relationship with South Korea. That's new. Previously, the Chinese have been imposing a range of unofficial sanctions on South Korea because of the South Koreans' deployment of this ballistic missile defense system called THAAD. The second one is actually very recent. This is exchange of telegrams between Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping. The China-North Korea relationship has been in a bad way. But since the 19th Party Congress, there's been a little footsie under the table. And as a result, I think new lines of political dialogue have opened up. Now, what this points to in terms of a specific measure agreed to between the Chinese and North Koreans, we do not know. But I find it modestly encouraging that there is some movement on these two factors in the advance of the President's visit.
And we should mention that H.R. McMaster, who we just saw there speaking at the White House, is saying that the U.S. is committed to the denuclearization of North Korea. You have developed a new dashboard that looks at China's standing, especially economically, looking at the economic data. What's your current reading of it, that standing? And then how does that inform China's positioning going into these meetings with President Trump?
Well, the big question coming out of the 19th Party Congress, which China has just concluded, is not Xi Jinping's power. Tick, done that. Two, will there continue to be an anti-corruption campaign against dissident elements within the Chinese Communist Party? Tick, yes. But three, what will now happen with the implementation of China's economic reform blueprint to create a new economic model for the future along the lines of the plan they outlined 3 or 4 years ago? Now, what we've put out today, the Asia Society Policy Institute and the Rhodium Group, is a conjoint analysis between us of 10 major reform areas, going from financial system reform to fiscal reform to land reform, environment reform, SOE reform, as well as fiscal reform, competition policy reform, to track whether this reform blueprint is actually heading in the right direction or not against China's own standards and against China's own data. And what we find is that, in fact, China's reform progress is fairly much standing still. You see some progress in the area of innovation policy, where the value added by industries using innovation within the production of a good or a service is in fact coming up. But in so many areas of critical reform, like state and enterprise reform, we see it standing still. In some areas, like labour market reform, sliding slightly backwards.
We've talked about the geopolitical implications of this trip on the issue of economic issues. You've got Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin staying behind to work on tax reform. You're not going to have the full complement of economic advisors traveling with the president to China. How much of a hindrance is that? And when you see China looking westward, talking about one belt, one road, is the role that the U.S. plays in encouraging reforms in China somehow diminished under this administration?
Well, it depends who else is with the president as part of his economic team on this particular visit. Remember, the Chinese will approach this summit in Beijing with two boxes. Here's the economy, trade, investment box. Here's the national security, let's call it North Korea problem box. So what can we deal with the United States on here, which sends our American visitors home in a reasonably happy frame of mind? I do not know the answer to that. I really don't. But I know the Chinese would have been working overtime in terms of what further bilateral trade concessions may be acceptable to the Americans. On the national security box, as we indicated before in our discussion, I would not be surprised if there is some modest progress. I have no hard data to base that on, just the signalling between the Chinese and the two Koreas. So I think if Wilbur Ross is there, for example, it's an okay team. The Chinese have been dealing with Wilbur for quite a long time.
Let's broaden it out beyond China, of course, because the president's going to be making other stops on this Asia trip. Given the current positioning rhetoric that is coming from the Trump administration, how do you think the Asia-Pacific region generally should be positioning itself, both on this trip and just in general politically?
Well, let me try and characterise what I see to be the attitude across the region at present. I just came back from Australia a couple of days ago and I was in China a week before that. I think the overwhelming sort of sense across the region is one of strategic uncertainty. That is, which way will President Trump take the administration? We've seen automatically the unilateral effect of taking the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which, as your report just said, without a counter-proposal to match along with it, which is of the depth and substance of the TPP. And so that causes a lot of people in the open trading business and open economies business to scratch their head from Tokyo to Singapore and most points in between. Then on the geopolitical front, people are saying, well, what is Trump's future posture on the South China Sea? Are all the eggs now in the North Korea basket? And if they're all in the North Korea basket, can China deliver? So I think the posture is one of uncertainty, but at the same time underpinning it is a continued respect for American power. One final point on that. There's this meeting each year, which is called the East Asia Summit. It's the only meeting in Asia which brings together the 18 key heads of government, 10 Southeast Asians, the 3 in Northeast Asia, Japan, South Korea, as well as China, India, Australia, New Zealand, plus the United States and Russia. President Obama has always been to these. I think it is very short-sighted that this administration indicated that President Trump won't be attending, not because the agenda is necessarily hot, but it's a bit like a country dance. Who shows up? And if the region sees the United States doesn't show up at its one big formal for the year, where open dialogue does occur on security questions, then it may lead to a regional conclusion the United States is not structurally engaged for the future.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it as always. That's Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, with the Asia Society Policy Institute, joining us here on set in New York.